Hey Critical Analysis, this is your video for Chapter 3 lecture. So honestly, to me, a lot of what we kind of talk about in Chapter 3 is like touched on a little bit in Chapters 1 and 2. So there is a little bit of overlap. So I'm going to go through, but as you can see on this next slide here, there are 3 major objectives: organizing academic information, annotating, and note-taking. So you may, depending on what semester this is for you, or maybe you're also taking student success skills right now, the SSC 101 or the IDS 115, like those type of classes, you're going to see that kind of overlap in those areas as well. They focus a lot on these type of skills. So first thing, talking about getting organized for college. Now, we're in a summer semester. That always makes it a little different because you are so fast-paced. And so you have to kind of accelerate these type of things. But a lot of these skills you're going to be able to build and use throughout different semesters as well. So talking about organizing for college study, you want to know what kind of reader you are. Meaning, how do you prefer to take in information? Do you prefer to read it silently, orally, someone read it to you? Do you like to listen? So you have to kind of know your preferences as a reader. You have to build these knowledge networks, meaning you have to lay some foundational knowledge. Maybe you have a chapter that you're unfamiliar with, so you're going to go and you're going to watch a video on it first, or you're going to ask some questions on it, or whatever that might look like. You're going to use an active study process. I emphasize the word active because oftentimes, and I know this was discussed in previous chapters, we are more passive in our reading. We just kind of have this on our to-do list and we check it off, but at the end of a chapter or a reading selection, we don't really know what we read because we weren't engaged in the reading. We have to organize our materials for learning. So let's talk about some of these. So building knowledge networks means how you can create, and use this word schemata, how you can create new information and connect it to what you already know. So if you're going to read a chapter on let's say building vocabulary, which just happens to be chapter 4, which we'll talk about in our next lecture video, vocabulary, context clues. And you're like, I think I remember talking about this in a previous class. So like thinking back and recalling what you already know about that topic, maybe previewing and looking ahead at the chapter, all of those are like making this web of information. So linking information together to what you already know, to what you're about to read, and it's going to expand that knowledge network. Some other things that this selection and this chapter talks about is study reading. So I've talked about like reading is just like the writing cycle. So we know, and I apologize, I think I said this in another video, but when we write, we know that we are not going to get the perfect draft the first time. We are going to have to read and reread and go back and do things to fix our writing. We're going to read through our draft, we're going to go back and we're going to edit. Same thing for reading. We have to really think about what we're reading, go and make notes and practice and reread a section or look at vocabulary, whatever that is. Really be active in that process. Some of that relates to the study process, and the studying and the reading goes together in a lot of ways. So previewing what you're about to study or read, to think about what you already know, to integrate information, to annotate. We're going to talk about annotating here in just a few minutes. So whenever it talks about these study process, whenever you are studying, again, this is connected to this like study and reading process, you want to recall what you already know, think about it, talk about it, write about it. It's kind of like these key things. Think, talk, write about what you are studying. One of the most powerful ways that you can verify that you know something is if you can tell someone else or teach someone else about it. There's also a huge connection between learning and writing. There's a lot of information that you can test yourself with by reading it and then by writing it, and vice versa. And so our chapter is going to talk about these kind of different ways, and I'm going to kind of click back and forth here in a few minutes and show you some examples as we look in our chapter 3. So you want to write about it. You want to make notes, whatever that looks like for you. Maybe it's bullet points, maybe it's Cornell method, maybe it's visual mapping. So you want to make sure that you're writing your information. You also want to then use a type of self-check or a partner check. So study the notes, use flashcards, jigsaw puzzle, which is where you go and you look at different parts and pieces. Practice tests is a really helpful way to make sure you understand information. Whether it's you make your own, whether it's like a book created one, a study guide, whatever that might look like. And then other ways of organizing textbook information is, and again, we've kind of touched on these a little bit. We're going to look more in depth in just a couple minutes. Annotating, Cornell note-taking style, outlining, and mapping. So what is annotating? So this is where I'm going to click here. I'm going to go to annotating because, here we go. It's going to talk to you a little bit more about annotating here in this section. It's going to show you kind of some ways that you can do so. This is just an example of how people might use symbols when they annotate. Here's an example of annotating. So what is annotating? It's essentially just pulling out information right in the margins of your page, of your sheet, of your chapter, or whatever it is, right there in the margins. And you are pulling out maybe a main idea, a key term, a question. When I annotate, I tend to ask a lot of questions. So I'll go in the margins and I'll like highlight, or I'll circle something and I'll write like, what does this mean? And that tells me like, hey, I need to think more about this. It's also not meant to be something, as you can see, for like a ton of writing. Like, look how quick this is. They're underlining, they're making some notes. They're putting some things over there. Sometimes you'll see like a real quick definition. Annotating is not like full-blown note-taking. Some people call it marginal notes because that's all it is. You're writing notes in the margins, but it's supposed to help you get more active in your reading. And so that's why it says like develop a system, what kind of works for you. For me, I didn't necessarily do the system. I did just straight up write, like here's what it's talking about right here. But again, in like abbreviated terms, because you don't have a lot of space with annotating. So again, annotating is when you are looking at the information, you pull out the main ideas, the major details, the vocabulary, the names, the dates, the questions, whatever it is, in very brief format. So one of the keys though is you should not annotate as you read, because just like note-taking or highlighting or underlining, as you read, you think everything's important. So you annotate everything. You read it first, and then you go back and you annotate your paragraph, your section, your chapter, whatever that might be. It's also helpful because if you have, let's say you have a 20-page article you have to read. Well, you might not have time to read all 20 pages in one sitting. So what you do instead is you read maybe 5 pages at a time. Go back and annotate, and then the next day, you're like, oh, what was that section about? You look at your annotations and it helps you just look a real quick, like, oh, that's what this was. And you can also use your annotations to build a summary. This next section talks about note-taking. So everyone needs to find like what kind of note-taking method works. And I'm going to say that not everyone needs to take notes. I know maybe that's not like the most couth thing I should say as a teacher, but there are some students who just don't need to take notes. You are a strong auditory learner. And so maybe your form of note-taking is just every once in a while jotting something down that you want to go back and look up or that you need to remember, but you can sit and take in information in a way that perceives and you understand it through just listening. Now, there are some people like myself, I am a read-write learner. I have to take notes. I'm not going to remember something if I do not write it down. That's both academically and personally. So you have to just know kind of what your preference is with that note-taking. And so you also have to know what system you're going to use. So coming up with a type of method, and this is what this section talks a little bit more about. The first section talks about Cornell Notes. So this kind of shows you how to set it up. You know, take a paper, put it into 2 sections, and I'm going to show you here in a minute with the book. Actually, let me just show you now. We're going to talk about note-taking. So I'm going to go to Cornell method. And this is going to, again, walk you through. And here's what the Cornell method looks like. You're folded it into 2 sections. The thinner section is the term or the question or whatever that might be. And then the larger section, you answer the question or you define the term or you go into more detail. It almost sets up like a study guide for you. And then oftentimes at the bottom, you can kind of create your own summary or use it just, as I said, as a study guide. So it's a very structured way to take notes. So if you struggle with taking notes in a way that is pleasing to look at, but also just you're all over the place, you're unorganized. Cornell Note method is really great for that. I like using it personally whenever I have a lot of information to kind of try to work through. So that's Cornell Note. Outlining is another way. Sometimes people think that outlining is just like, oh, I have a paper or a presentation, and so I have to create an outline. But outlining can also be a note-taking method. And so this walks you through like, here, this is what outlining looks like. And I will, again, go down here so you can see some more examples. Like here is how you could set it up. It has the Roman numerals and the letters. Here's a nice example of outlining right here. When you outline, you're, again, like a lot of other things, you read through first and then start outlining using phrases, pulling out key terms, putting in your own words again, like you're making sure that you're paraphrasing. So that's if you feel like outlining is a method for you. Again, it's very structured in a different way that Cornell Notes are, but this is very structured as well. And then we have mapping. Mapping is the most visual way of looking at information. And so if you are that visual learner, so let me again go down here. I'm going to give you some examples. Mapping can really refer to a broad range of things because as you can see, like mapping can be some sort of like a herringbone, it can be a web, it can be a Venn diagram. And so this is kind of going to show you a couple of those examples. But if you're a visual learner, mapping is a great way to start kind of showing how ideas are connected. You can diagram major points. You can organize it in a way that's going to stick out to you visually. Okay. And it's usually not for a ton of information. As you can see, it's usually like smaller amounts of information, or you're condensing information in that way so that you can kind of really look at that in a visual manner. If you have a lot of text, you usually want to use more of like the Cornell Note, or some of you might use bullet points or something like that. All right, so that is the meat of chapter 3. As I have in previous lectures, I encourage you to go ahead and look through these sections more in detail on your own. Really look into that study process, look into what annotating is and how it looks like. Would that work for you? What about Cornell Notes? What about outlining, mapping? You know, and again, you're taking away what works for you. Not everything that is going to be discussed in every single chapter is going to benefit you personally every time. The key is finding these tools and then knowing how to utilize them. All right, so that is chapter 3. I will be back later with future videos for chapter 3 assignments and vocabulary.